Come here, boy. Let's see what you can do with this game. The voice of Clarissa Blackwood, a wealthy socialite from one of the most affluent neighborhoods in the city, echoed through the lavish living room of her mansion. It was a voice dripping with disdain, as though it was a game just waiting to be won, before it even started. Her words, laced with both sarcasm and superiority, were aimed at Jamal Santos, a 17-year-old boy serving at the extravagant charity dinner she had organized. Jamal, a quiet and thoughtful teenager, had been helping his mother, Elena, who worked as Blackwood's maid, serve hors d'oeuvres to a room full of influential businessmen and politicians. It was supposed to be an evening for raising funds for underprivileged children, but the irony was thick. While the rich sipped champagne and chatted about their extravagant lives, Jamal's family was silently contributing to their wealth, working tirelessly for a fraction of what they could never dream of affording. "What do you say, Jamal?" Clarissa asked again, her tone mocking as she gestured toward the elegant chess set on the coffee table. "Why don't you show me how you play chess wherever you're from? It'll be fun. Maybe we can even teach you a thing or two." The room fell into a murmur of laughter, and for a moment, Jamal could feel every gaze fixated on him, judging. He wasn't just a guest at this so-called charity event, he was the entertainment, the object of their amusement. The guests, dressed in their finest suits and designer gowns, leaned forward with eager curiosity. They thought it would be amusing to watch a poor kid from the slums try to play a game of intellect, a game they had mastered in their sheltered, privileged lives. But Jamal wasn't just any kid. He had lived his life in the shadows of society's prejudice, but in those shadows, he had found something precious: resilience. He had learned to watch, listen, and understand more than most people gave him credit for. And in that moment, with the weight of their expectations bearing down on him, Jamal made a decision. He would play this game not just to win, but to change the way they saw him, to show them that intellect wasn't a privilege, it was earned. As the guests continued to laugh and gossip, Elena clenched her fists at the side, her heart heavy with frustration. She had spent years working in this mansion, serving these people, and to watch her son treated like this, it was a humiliation she couldn't fully express. "I've been working here for 20 years, she muttered to herself, "and now they're using my boy as a joke." But Jamal didn't flinch. He stood still for a moment, then calmly walked over to the chessboard. There was no hesitation in his steps. "I'll play," he said, his voice quiet but filled with a calm determination that made the room pause. Clarissa, her smile growing wider, adjusted her diamond earrings and settled into a plush armchair. "I always play white," she said, as if it were a royal tradition, one that could never be broken. "Now, let's see what you've got, Jamal. Show us how you play the game." Jamal nodded silently, setting up his pieces with precision. As he moved, the guests laughed again, but this time, there was a slight unease in their voices. They had underestimated him, and what they didn't know was that they were about to be shown just how wrong they were. This wasn't just a game. For Jamal, this was a chance to change the rules. The atmosphere in the lavish living room had changed. What had begun as a mocking game was now unfolding into something much more serious. As the guests of Clarissa Blackwood leaned back in their expensive chairs, champagne glasses in hand, the tone in the room was no longer one of casual amusement but of uncomfortable curiosity. The jokes had stopped, replaced by quiet whispers and the occasional sideways glance at Jamal Santos, the 17-year-old boy who had quietly taken control of the chessboard before him. Jamal sat across from Clarissa, his gaze steady as he carefully considered the board. In the weeks leading up to this moment, his mind had been working on a much bigger plan, one that would shatter the assumptions people like Clarissa had about him. He had always known that intelligence had little to do with wealth, status, or skin color. His passion for chess had grown over the years, nurtured in the most unexpected of places, the small public library in his neighborhood, where old, discarded chess books became his greatest treasure. While his friends were outside playing games or hanging out, Jamal was glued to those books, learning strategies from grandmasters, memorizing openings and defenses, studying classic games from legends like Kasparov and Fischer. Clarissa had no idea that Jamal's love for chess wasn't just a hobby, it was his lifeline. He had been playing chess in his mind for years, perfecting his game in silence, never seeking approval or recognition. His skill had been cultivated in the same way his mother, Elena, had learned to serve with grace, out of necessity. Every move he made now was a reflection of his journey, the silent hours spent studying, the hours of watching his mother work double shifts while he studied on his own, hungry for a future he would create with his own hands. Victoria sat back in her plush chair, clearly enjoying the game. "Let's see if you can at least make it interesting, Jamal," she said with a mock grin, eyes glinting with condescension. She moved her first piece, a pawn to e4, trying to take control of the center in typical chess fashion. She had studied chess in social clubs and family gatherings, knowing the basics but never truly understanding the nuances of the game. She assumed that, like most things in her world, money and position would guarantee her success. "A classic opening," she said with a smug smile, "learned that from Harvard, you know." The guests chuckled, a few murmuring their agreement, but Jamal did not respond to her taunts. He simply took a moment, studied the board, and moved his own pawn to c5, the Sicilian defense, one of the most aggressive and sophisticated responses to one. e4. A pause followed as the guests took in this move. There was a subtle shift in the air. The laughter began to die down, and even Clarissa's face showed a flicker of hesitation. She had expected Jamal to move the pieces in clumsy, random ways, not with the focus and intensity of a serious player. "Interesting," murmured Jennifer Mills, a congresswoman seated near the window. She leaned forward, intrigued by the move. "I didn't expect that from him." Jamal's fingers moved with purpose, each piece placed thoughtfully. He wasn't in a rush. He knew this game was about more than just the match, it was about shifting perceptions. Every move he made sent a message. He wasn't here to entertain or play into their stereotypes. He was here to prove something, that intellect, talent, and dignity could not be bought, nor could they be hidden behind the veil of wealth and privilege. Clarissa, still thinking of herself as the expert, made her next move, nf3, following the pattern she had learned from her social circle. It was a safe, predictable move, the kind that she had seen played many times at dinner parties, the kind that promised no surprises. She looked at Jamal and let out a light laugh. "The knight moves in an L shape, you know. I hope you've at least read about that." The words were meant to belittle, to remind Jamal of his place. But Jamal, instead of reacting defensively, responded with a move that demonstrated his deep understanding of the game. "nc6, he said softly, moving his knight. The piece slid smoothly across the board, developing it with purpose, controlling key squares. Developing the knight with tempo, he explained under his breath, barely audible to the guests, but enough for Mr. Hamilton, the hotel mogul, to look at the board in surprise. He had heard of the Sicilian dragon, a sharp and complex variation, but he had never seen someone his age play it with such finesse. He glanced over at Clarissa, his curiosity piqued. The atmosphere had shifted once more. Victoria, now unsure of herself, tried to maintain her composure. "It's just a series of moves," she said, trying to regain control. "Nothing too impressive yet." But the guests weren't so sure anymore. Jamal's every move was meticulous, almost mechanical. He wasn't just playing the game in front of him, he was breaking down the walls of perception, one square at a time. Each piece that he moved created harmony on the board, a calculated design only someone who truly understood the game could create. The guests, once certain of their superiority, were now starting to feel the sting of their own prejudices. Jamal wasn't the poor, uneducated kid they had imagined. He was a prodigy, one who had mastered a game that they thought belonged to their exclusive world. The deepening silence the game continued, with Victoria becoming increasingly uneasy. She had thought she could crush Jamal effortlessly, humiliate him in front of her friends, but she was quickly realizing that he was not just any teenager. He was playing at a level she didn't understand. "Come on, Victoria, don't just sit there," one of the guests, Mr. Hamilton, spoke up. He was a chess player himself, having played in university years ago. He had recognized the pattern Jamal was setting up, but Victoria hadn't yet caught on. "This boy isn't just playing. He's setting up something big." Victoria, who had always prided herself on her knowledge and grace, was starting to crack. Her moves, once confident and planned, now seemed hollow, almost desperate. "Nonsense," she muttered, trying to convince herself that Jamal was just lucky. "He's just memorized a few tricks. He's nothing more than a kid from the slums." But the truth was becoming undeniable. Jamal was outplaying her. Every move she made, he countered with precision, with an elegance that belied his age and background. The game was no longer about the pieces, it was about the truth that was slowly unfolding before everyone in the room. As the guests watched, the tension grew. What had started as a game of arrogance and prejudice was now transforming into a battle of wits. Jamal, once underestimated and overlooked, was now holding the room's attention. He wasn't just playing for the win. He was playing for his dignity, for his mother's sacrifice, and for everyone who had ever been judged based on their appearance. The silence in the room deepened. The laughter had faded, replaced by a sense of awe, a sense of discomfort. They could no longer ignore the brilliance of the young boy sitting across from Victoria. And in that moment, Jamal knew he had already won. Not the game of chess, but the game of life. He had shown them all that the only true measure of greatness lay not in wealth or privilege, but in the power of the mind, the heart, and the quiet determination to never be underestimated. The tension in the air was palpable. The guests of Clarissa Blackwood's charity dinner had settled into a strange, stunned silence, their eyes fixed on the chessboard that lay between Jamal Santos and the smug socialite who had foolishly invited him to play. It was clear now that this was no longer just a game of chess, it had become something much more. Clarissa, who had expected to humiliate Jamal in front of her affluent friends, was beginning to realize that she had underestimated him in the most profound way. Jamal's calmness only added to the quiet tension in the room. He hadn't said much since the game began, allowing his moves to speak for him. His every decision on the board had been calculated, deliberate, and executed with an ease that contrasted with the nervous, almost frantic movements of Clarissa. She had started with the arrogance of someone who believed her wealth and education would ensure her success, but as the game progressed, that confidence slowly eroded. At first, the guests had chuckled, amused at the idea of watching a slum kid try to play chess. But as the game unfolded, it became evident that Jamal was no amateur. The young man who had spent years studying chess in the quiet corners of a public library, poring over books by grandmasters and watching legendary matches on a beaten-up computer, was no longer the object of ridicule. He was now the one in control, and the room was beginning to feel his presence. Clarissa's struggle. Clarissa Blackwood was used to getting what she wanted. She had grown up with privilege, surrounded by wealth and adoration, and she carried herself with the unshakable confidence of someone who had never known failure. But as Jamal moved his pieces on the board with purpose, her certainty began to crumble. She had been so sure that her social status, her Harvard education, and her years of social gatherings would guarantee her victory. Now, she found herself questioning her assumptions. "This boy is moving too fast," Clarissa murmured, her voice a little shaky. She had expected to take her time with each move, to revel in her superiority, but Jamal's precision made it clear that he was outpacing her at every turn. "In real chess, you think before you play," she added, though it sounded more like a defense than a true observation. Jamal didn't respond. He didn't need to. His every move had already spoken volumes. It wasn't about the time he spent thinking. It was about the years of study, the countless hours spent analyzing grandmaster matches, the games he had memorized. Each move he made had purpose, and each piece he advanced was part of a larger strategy, a strategy that Clarissa could never have imagined. As the game progressed, Jamal's movements became more confident. He didn't just respond to Clarissa's moves, he anticipated them. It was as if he could read the game in its entirety, seeing the pieces on the board as part of a much bigger picture, a picture that Clarissa wasn't yet able to comprehend. Clarissa played defensively, trying to hold on to control of the game, but it was clear she was losing ground. Each move she made seemed to fall right into Jamal's hands, and his calm demeanor only served to unnerve her further. The smug smile she had worn earlier faded, replaced by a furrowed brow and tight lips. The underestimation unravels. Jamal had known from the moment he stepped into the room that this game was about more than just a match of chess. It was about proving something, not just to Clarissa, but to everyone in the room who had made assumptions about him. When he was younger, he had been told that people like him, people from his background, didn't belong in the same circles as the rich and the powerful. He had heard the whispers, the derisive comments, the assumption that his worth was measured by his address, his family's occupation, and the color of his skin. But Jamal knew that worth was never about what others saw on the outside, it was about what one carried inside. And now, as the pieces moved on the board, he was making a point to everyone who had ever looked down on him. The years he had spent in the public library, reading and memorizing strategies, studying games from the likes of Kasparov, Fischer, and Carlsen, had brought him to this moment. He wasn't just playing chess, he was dismantling the prejudice that had been ingrained in society. His victory here wouldn't just be a personal triumph, it would be a lesson to everyone who had ever underestimated someone based on their background or their circumstances. As he glanced up from the board, his eyes briefly meeting the gaze of his mother, Elena, standing at the edge of the room, a quiet sense of pride filled him. She had always believed in him, even when the world hadn't. She had worked long hours, often sacrificing her own dreams to give him the chance to learn, to grow, and to succeed. Now, Jamal was repaying that faith. He wasn't just playing for himself. He was playing for her, for their family, and for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. But for Clarissa, this wasn't just a game anymore. It was a fight for control. She had invited Jamal into her home to show off her superiority, but now she was beginning to realize that her carefully constructed world was unraveling. Each move Jamal made stripped away another layer of her arrogance, and the guests who had once laughed at him now watched in stunned silence, their admiration for the young prodigy growing with every move. The turning point as the game reached the midpoint, Clarissa made her first significant blunder. In an attempt to regain control, she moved her queen aggressively, but it was a reckless move, one that Jamal had anticipated. With a swift and calculated move, Jamal sacrificed a piece to set a trap, a move that would force Clarissa into a vulnerable position. The room fell into a stunned silence as the guests realized what had just happened. "Victoria, he's setting up a trap," Mr. Hamilton whispered urgently to Clarissa, his voice laced with disbelief. "He's playing a variation of the Sicilian dragon." Victoria's face twisted with confusion. "What? He's just a kid. He can't possibly be playing the dragon." She tried to dismiss Hamilton's comment, but there was no denying it. Jamal wasn't just playing the game, he was playing her. The pieces on the board were no longer just pieces, they were symbols of something larger, something far more important than a simple chess match. Clarissa hesitated, her thoughts racing. She had made a mistake, but could she recover from it? She glanced nervously at her guests, unsure of how to salvage her position. But Jamal, undeterred by the pressure, continued to play with the same precision, the same calm focus that had defined his every move. He wasn't worried about winning. He wasn't even worried about impressing anyone. He was simply doing what he had always done, thinking, analyzing, and playing the game. The psychological play. Jamal's next move stunned everyone. He had set the stage for what would be a brilliant checkmate in just a few moves. His eyes, calm and steady, scanned the board as he made his final preparations. Clarissa, desperate to find a way out, made a few hasty moves, but they only sealed her fate. The tension in the room was unbearable. Clarissa was sweating now, her breath quickening as she realized just how badly she had underestimated Jamal. "This isn't possible," she muttered to herself, her hands shaking as she reached for a piece, only to realize it was too late. Jamal had already calculated her every move, and now she was trapped. "No, I'm not losing to this boy," she thought, but the words rang hollow. "Checkmate," Jamal said softly, his voice cutting through the silence. It was the moment that had been building throughout the game. With a single move, he had won. But it wasn't just a chess victory, it was the unraveling of Clarissa's pride, her arrogance, and her entire worldview. The aftermath. Clarissa stared at the board, disbelief written all over her face. The pieces lay in their final positions, and it was clear that she had lost, not just the game, but also any sense of control over the situation. Jamal had not just played the game. He had rewritten every assumption in that room about who deserved respect, about who was capable, and about who could rise above the limitations others placed on them. As the guests exchanged awkward glances, Jamal stood up, his gaze never wavering. He wasn't gloating, he was simply walking away from a battle that had never been about chess. It had always been about proving that true talent cannot be measured by background or status, it is earned, through determination, sacrifice, and hard work. Clarissa looked up at the room, her face pale with the weight of her humiliation. She had tried to humiliate Jamal, but in the end, it was she who had been outplayed. And as she stood there, surrounded by her guests, who now looked at her with a mixture of pity and judgment, she realized that this was a lesson she would carry with her forever. The truth had been exposed. Jamal had not just won a chess game. He had shown that true greatness is not determined by wealth, status, or social class, but by the ability to see beyond surface-level judgments and to create something extraordinary from the depths of one's own mind and heart. The moment of checkmate was more than just a victory in a game of chess. For Jamal Santos, it was the culmination of years of effort, sacrifice, and quiet dedication. His mother, Elena, had always taught him to be resilient, to never let anyone define him by his circumstances. And now, in the most unlikely of settings, he had an opportunity to prove that not only was he capable, but he was far more than the assumptions others had about him. In the grand mansion of Clarissa Blackwood, a woman who had spent her entire life surrounded by wealth and privilege, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The sound of clinking glasses and hushed whispers filled the room as Jamal sat calmly, staring at the chessboard. His every move had been calculated with precision. The once confident woman who had invited him to play was now visibly flustered, sweat beading on her forehead, her fingers shaking as she realized that the game was slipping from her grasp. "Checkmate," Jamal said simply, his voice low but carrying the weight of a quiet triumph. He didn't gloat, didn't boast about his victory. His calm demeanor was a reflection of the many years he had spent in the shadows, watching and learning, honing his craft in secret. But now, in front of everyone who had doubted him, he had done what no one thought possible, he had outplayed Clarissa. And he had done it with grace, with patience, and with a quiet strength that left her speechless. Clarissa, on the other hand, was struggling to come to terms with her loss. "This can't be happening," she muttered to herself, her mind racing to rationalize what had just transpired. "I'm being beaten by a kid from the slums. This isn't possible." Her pride had been wounded in a way she had never anticipated. She had been so sure of her superiority, so certain that her wealth and social status would guarantee her victory. And now, here she was, sitting across from a 17-year-old boy who had just dismantled her with a game she thought she knew so well. The guests, once eager for the spectacle of watching a poor kid try to play chess, were now sitting in stunned silence. The mocking laughter had died down, replaced by a palpable sense of unease. Jamal, in his quiet way, had changed the dynamics of the room. What was supposed to be a humiliating moment for him had, instead, become a moment of reckoning for Clarissa. Clarissa's denial. Clarissa tried to recover, but her usual poise had evaporated. "You must have seen that sequence somewhere," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "No one learns to play like that on their own." You've memorized some moves from the internet, right? You must have. But Jamal only smiled, his expression unchanged. You're right, he said softly. I learned it from one of the best. Garry Kasparov. At the mention of Kasparov's name, the room seemed to shift. Mr. Hamilton, who had been watching the game closely, leaned forward in surprise. Kasparov taught you? He asked incredulously. He had been a competitive chess player in his youth, and even he knew the magnitude of what Jamal was saying. Not personally, Jamal replied, his voice calm, but carrying a quiet confidence. But I studied his games. 1,083 games, to be exact. I've memorized them all. The room fell into complete silence. The guests exchanged glances, their previous mockery replaced by a sense of awe. Clarissa, still sitting at the chessboard, looked defeated. She had no more words to defend herself. For the first time in her life, she was facing someone who was her intellectual equal, and who had risen from a background she would never understand. The guests' reaction as the silence continued, Jennifer Mills, the congresswoman who had been quietly observing the game, shifted in her seat. She had been skeptical at first, unsure of how the game would unfold, but now, watching Jamal calmly dismantle Clarissa, she felt an odd sense of admiration. This kid, she murmured, her voice filled with respect. He's brilliant. Hamilton, who had been skeptical about the entire affair, leaned over to Clarissa. Victoria, you've underestimated him. This boy's a prodigy. You can't just chalk this up to luck. Clarissa looked at the board, her pride shattering. Luck, she said bitterly, her eyes narrowing. It wasn't luck. He must have been trained by someone to humiliate me. But even as she said the words, she knew they rang hollow. She was looking for an excuse, anything to explain away her defeat. The truth was staring her in the face, and it was hard for her to swallow. Jamal hadn't needed fancy lessons or a tutor. He had learned on his own, out of sheer determination and the desire to prove that he was more than what the world expected of him. Jamal stood from the chessboard, but instead of walking away with a triumphant smile, he turned to his mother, Elena, who had been standing silently by the side of the room, her face flushed with both pride and anxiety. Jamal's movements were measured, his eyes never leaving the board as he walked to where his mother stood. Mom, he said in a low voice, one that carried more weight than the simple words seemed to convey. Remember when you said that one day I would show these people who we really are? Elena nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. She had always known her son's potential, but to see him standing there, the very embodiment of all the quiet hours spent studying, all the sacrifices they had made, was overwhelming. I remember, baby, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I remember. Clarissa, still seated at the chessboard, couldn't ignore the look of quiet confidence on Jamal's face. It wasn't just about the chess game anymore. It was about the deeper truth that was being exposed, a truth she wasn't ready to accept. Her entire world, built on privilege and assumptions, had just been shattered in a matter of minutes. This isn't over, she muttered to herself, her hands shaking as she absent-mindedly knocked a few pieces over. Her words were directed at no one in particular, just a desperate attempt to salvage some semblance of control. No one learns that kind of strategy on their own. He must have been trained to make me look like this. He's a pawn in some larger game. But Jamal wasn't playing a game of humiliation, he was playing a game of respect. He wasn't looking to prove anyone wrong, he was simply showing them the truth, that intelligence, talent, and ability are not bound by race, class, or social standing. It wasn't about showing off or gloating. It was about showing that anyone can rise above the limitations imposed on them by others. As Elena watched her son, she knew that his victory was about more than just the chess match. It was about everything they had endured, everything they had worked for. It was about proving that no one's worth is determined by their background, and in that moment, Jamal had proven that his worth was limitless. Clarissa's isolation meanwhile, the other guests had begun to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The atmosphere in the room was no longer one of celebration or admiration for the hostess. It was heavy with the realization of what had just transpired. For the first time in her life, Clarissa was the one being looked at with pity. "That's enough, Victoria," Mr. Hamilton said quietly, his voice a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. "You've been outplayed, and everyone here can see it." Clarissa turned to him, frustration and anger flaring in her eyes. "Outplayed?" she said, her voice rising. "This was supposed to be a joke. This was supposed to be easy." But the truth was undeniable. Jamal had proven that anyone, regardless of their background, could excel if given the chance. The assumptions made about him, about his worth and his ability, had been completely wrong. Clarissa, her face flushed with anger and humiliation, finally stood up from the chessboard. "You must have seen that move somewhere," she said weakly, trying to salvage some sense of dignity. "No one plays like that on their own. He's memorized every move, every sequence." "You're right," Jamal said calmly, his voice steady. "I learned it from one of the greatest. Garry Kasparov." There was a finality in his words that left no room for argument. Jamal's victory had been about more than just the game, it had been about exposing the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. The real victory. As Jamal and Elena left the room, the guests, one by one, began to exchange uncomfortable glances. Some shifted in their seats, unsure of how to process what had just occurred. Congresswoman Mills had discreetly begun recording the entire event on her phone. She knew this story would go viral, it was far too important to ignore. In the days that followed, the video of the match between Jamal and Clarissa Blackwood spread like wildfire. It wasn't just about chess. It was about the deeper social implications of prejudice, privilege, and underestimation. Jamal's victory was a moment that would go down in history, not just for the chessboard tactics he had executed with such precision, but for the message he sent: intelligence cannot be measured by wealth, race, or social class. Clarissa's fall from grace was swift. She lost not only the respect of her peers but also her social standing. Her charity events were overshadowed by the public backlash, and her reputation, built over years of flaunting her wealth, was destroyed. In contrast, Jamal Santos became an inspiration. His success was celebrated, not because of his circumstances but because of his ability to rise above them. His story became one of perseverance, self-taught brilliance, and defiance against the systems that sought to hold him back. The silence that followed the chess match was suffocating. No one spoke. Clarissa Blackwood sat there, her hand still gripping a chess piece, her mind whirling. She had lost, not just the game, but the game of perception, the game of control, and worst of all, she had lost her grip on her own arrogance. Jamal Santos, the 17-year-old boy she had invited into her mansion as entertainment, had beaten her at her own game, and in doing so, had exposed a truth she couldn't ignore: her wealth, her privilege, her social status, they didn't matter here. The game had been a battlefield of intellect, and she had come out the loser. Jamal's calm demeanor in the wake of his victory only added to the crushing weight of Clarissa's defeat. Elena, his mother, stood at the side, her expression unreadable. She had always known her son's worth, but to see him standing there, having just dismantled the assumptions of an entire room full of wealthy, powerful people, was overwhelming. In the silence, the air was thick with discomfort. The guests, initially so eager to witness what they thought would be a spectacle, were now left with a sense of unease. The smug laughter that had once filled the room had evaporated, replaced by an awkward stillness. The person who had been at the center of the evening's entertainment, Jamal, the poor kid, was now the most respected person in the room, while the socialite who had invited him to play had become an object of pity. Clarissa's realization. Clarissa shifted in her chair, trying to find something to grasp onto, anything that could pull her out of the uncomfortable reality that was unfolding. She had never been defeated like this, not in front of her peers, not in her own home. The idea that Jamal had beaten her, an uneducated, self-taught boy from the slums, was a bitter pill to swallow. She had always prided herself on being in control, on knowing the game, both literally and figuratively. But here, with all her wealth and influence, she had been undone by someone who had none of those things. "This is impossible," Clarissa muttered under her breath, her voice shaky. "How could I lose to him?" Jamal, ever the picture of composure, didn't respond. He didn't need to. He wasn't here to gloat, to rub his victory in her face. For Jamal, this wasn't about showing off, it was about showing that intelligence and talent are not bound by wealth, race, or privilege. They are earned, through hard work, perseverance, and dedication. He had spent years studying chess, analyzing grandmaster games, memorizing openings and defenses, while most of the people in this room had lived their lives in the comfortable bubble of wealth. As he looked around the room, his eyes briefly met those of Mr. Hamilton, the hotel mogul, who was watching him with a look of genuine admiration. "Victoria," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this kid's a genius. He's outplayed you in a way no one expected." Clarissa's pride flared. She couldn't let him get the best of her, not now, not in front of these people. "I wasn't outplayed," she snapped. "He memorized some moves from the internet. He didn't beat me fairly. This was all set up." But even as she said the words, she knew they were hollow. She had underestimated Jamal, and now, it was clear that she had misjudged him entirely. "A kid from the slums," she whispered to herself, "defeated me in my own house." The guests shifted as Clarissa's words echoed through the room. A few of the guests began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The glamour and allure of wealth and privilege had started to lose its luster. Congresswoman Mills, who had been silently observing the game, leaned forward, her interest piqued by Jamal's unshakable composure. "He's incredible," she said to no one in particular. "The way he played. You could see the strategy unfolding." Her words, though quiet, had a ripple effect on the others. Mr. Hamilton, who had initially found the whole spectacle amusing, was now fully engrossed in the game's aftermath. He had spent years in business, analyzing deals, studying patterns, but he had never seen anyone approach a game with the calm precision that Jamal had demonstrated. "Victoria, you've misjudged him," Hamilton continued, his voice tinged with respect. "This kid's not just some amateur. He's a self-taught prodigy, and he's a hell of a lot more than what you thought he was." Clarissa's gaze shifted from the chessboard to the guests around her. The faces that had once held admiration for her were now filled with uncertainty. Mr. Hamilton, Congresswoman Mills, and others were no longer looking at her with the same respect. They were looking at her with a quiet sense of judgment, a silent disapproval that she had never experienced in her privileged life. "You were wrong," Hamilton said, his tone now blunt. "This wasn't a joke for him. It was a challenge. And he's shown us all what true talent looks like." Clarissa's shoulders tensed. She wanted to argue, to justify herself, but she knew she couldn't. She had played this game with every ounce of arrogance and superiority that had defined her life. And now, in front of everyone, she had lost, not just the game, but the very sense of control she had always clung to. Jamal's moment of truth. Jamal, however, was no longer concerned with the opinions of the guests. He had come to this event not to impress anyone, but to prove something much deeper. The chessboard had become a metaphor for the larger game of life, a game in which his background, his race, and his status were often used against him. His every move, his every decision in the game, was part of a larger strategy to break free from the limitations others had imposed on him. As Jamal rose from the chair and walked over to Elena, his mother, the guests watched in awe. He had played with a quiet intensity, a determination that was visible in every move, and now, as he stood beside his mother, that same strength radiated from him. "Mom," Jamal said softly, his voice filled with a quiet but profound determination. "Remember when you told me that one day I would show these people who we really are?" Elena's eyes welled up with tears as she looked at her son. She had known his potential long before anyone else did, but to see him standing there, having just dismantled every assumption people had made about him, was overwhelming. "I remember," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I remember, baby." In that moment, Jamal knew that this wasn't just about chess. It was about something far bigger. About breaking down the barriers that society had placed in his way. It was about showing the world that his worth wasn't defined by his circumstances, that he could rise above them, and that anyone, no matter their background, could do the same. Clarissa's isolation. As the evening went on, the energy in the room began to shift. Clarissa, once the center of attention, was now isolated. Her friends, the people she had once looked down on others to impress, were no longer in her corner. Instead, they had all seen her for what she truly was, someone who had relied on her privilege and wealth to manipulate others, to control them. But now, in front of Jamal, it was clear that true power comes from within, and that's something money can't buy. "It's over, Victoria," Mr. Hamilton said, his voice no longer full of admiration for her but of disappointment. "This wasn't a show, it wasn't a joke. You've been outplayed by a kid who's earned every move he made." Clarissa felt the weight of his words press down on her. Her entire life had been built on the idea that wealth was the measure of one's worth, that social class could guarantee success. But she had just learned the most painful lesson of all, that true greatness comes not from the things you own or the circles you move in, but from the way you carry yourself, the way you work hard and earn respect. She looked back at the board, at the pieces that were now scattered across the Italian marble, and she felt a sense of shame she had never known before. The game wasn't just about the pieces, it was about the truth. And that truth was one that Clarissa wasn't ready to face. Jamal's silent triumph. As Jamal and Elena left the room, the silence was deafening. Clarissa remained seated at the chessboard, her hand still hovering over the pieces, as if she could somehow will the game into a different outcome. But she couldn't. The pieces were set, and so was her fate. As Jamal stepped out of the mansion and into the cool night air, a sense of peace washed over him. He wasn't thinking about the victory, he was thinking about the future. The world had tried to limit him, to box him in with labels and expectations. But tonight, he had rewritten the rules, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. "Mom," Jamal said, looking up at the stars as they walked down the path, "this is just the beginning." Elena smiled, her heart swelling with pride. She had always known her son was destined for greatness, but now, the world would know it too. And as they walked home, their journey far from over, Clarissa Blackwood sat in the mansion, surrounded by her guests, but for the first time in her life, she realized she was completely alone. The night had begun with so much promise. Clarissa Blackwood had arranged the evening's charity event with the anticipation of a successful fundraiser. The room, filled with wealthy businessmen, politicians, and other socialites, was brimming with excitement, all centered around the lavish dinner and speeches about philanthropy. Yet, in the span of a few hours, the entire evening had turned into something much more profound than anyone could have imagined. Jamal Santos had come to the event as an unwitting guest, asked by Clarissa to play a casual game of chess for the amusement of the others. What started as a cruel joke quickly morphed into a game of humiliation for Clarissa as Jamal, the self-taught chess prodigy from a humble background, outplayed her in front of her most important guests. It wasn't just a chess game. It was a fight for respect. A battle between the social classes, where the very system Clarissa had built her life around was completely dismantled. By the time the game ended in checkmate, it was clear that Jamal had won something far greater than a game of chess. He had claimed victory over the prejudice that had long sought to define him. Clarissa's denial. Sitting at the chessboard, Clarissa Blackwood was a picture of defeat. The smug, self-assured woman who had confidently strutted into the evening with every expectation of humiliating Jamal was now shattered. Her hands trembled as she reached for the pieces, but her eyes never left the board. "This can't be happening," she whispered under her breath, though she knew the reality of the situation all too well. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had spent her life building a reputation on her wealth and status, believing that money, education, and social circles were the keys to power. But she had failed to see what truly mattered: intellect, perseverance, and character. She wasn't prepared for Jamal's calm, collected genius on the chessboard. As much as she tried to rationalize it, he must have memorized those moves. He's just a kid who got lucky. She knew that deep down, it was not luck. Jamal had been playing chess for years, studying grandmasters and perfecting his craft while the rest of the world was preoccupied with their wealth and privileges. His victory wasn't about one game, it was about everything he had quietly mastered. Clarissa took in a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I can't let them see me like this," she muttered, her eyes darting around the room. She had become a spectacle, not for her success or wealth, but for her humiliating defeat. Her guests, once in awe of her, were now watching with pity, disappointment, and silent judgment. For the first time in her life, Clarissa was the one being judged. The turning of the tables, the guests were no longer whispering behind their champagne glasses, as they had at the start of the evening. The air was thick with a strange mixture of discomfort and admiration. It was clear that Jamal Santos had left a lasting impression on them. Not just through his brilliant moves on the chessboard, but through his quiet defiance of the assumptions they had made about him. The silent moments after the checkmate felt heavier than any word spoken could convey. Mr. Hamilton, the hotel mogul who had once scoffed at Jamal's presence, now looked at the young man with respect. "Victoria," he said, his voice careful and measured, "you've been outplayed by a kid who's self-taught and clearly knows more about the game than any of us." There was no derision in his voice, no sarcasm, only the quiet truth. "This kid's a genius." Congresswoman Jennifer Mills, who had been observing the game from the sidelines, couldn't hide her fascination any longer. "I've been watching this whole time," she said, leaning forward. "This kid, he knows the game like a seasoned pro. He's brilliant." As they all turned to Clarissa, she could feel the walls closing in. These were the people who had respected her, the people who had once admired her position in society. Now, they were watching her, the woman who had tried to humiliate a brilliant young man, and she was left speechless. For the first time in her life, she was being confronted with a reality she couldn't control, and she hated it. Jamal's quiet strength. Jamal, for his part, remained calm throughout the ordeal. His victory over Clarissa had never been about proving his worth. He had nothing to prove to her or anyone else. It was about acknowledging his own strength, his own journey, and the sacrifices he had made to get to this point. He hadn't won the game for applause, nor had he sought recognition. His victory was in his quiet resilience, in his ability to stay composed under the pressure of being underestimated. He didn't look at Clarissa with triumph in his eyes. Instead, his gaze was steady, almost calm, as he turned away from the board. "Thank you for the game, Mrs. Blackwood," he said politely, his voice soft but powerful. It was educational. The irony of the moment was not lost on the guests. They had come expecting a show of superiority, but instead, they had witnessed the unraveling of their preconceived notions. Jamal had not only outplayed Clarissa at chess, he had shown them that true intelligence and grit weren't defined by wealth or status. It was the quiet, self-taught boy who had won, and he had done so with dignity, grace, and wisdom far beyond his years. Elena, standing off to the side, could barely hold back her tears. She had always known Jamal's potential. She had watched him study, watched him grow, and now, she was seeing him live out a moment she had always hoped for. Her son had proven to the world that he was more than they had ever imagined. Clarissa's isolation. Clarissa, unable to process her defeat, sat frozen at the board. Her hand reached out to adjust a piece, but she stopped short, unable to make the move. Her world, her carefully curated reality, had crumbled. In her desperation to maintain control, she had invited Jamal into her home, expecting him to be nothing more than an amusing distraction. What she hadn't counted on was his quiet defiance, his refusal to accept the label she had placed on him. "You thought you could beat me easily," she thought bitterly. "You thought I was just a joke." But the truth was undeniable, Jamal had beaten her, not just in chess, but in a game of perceptions. He had exposed the flaws in her own thinking, the limitations she had placed on him because of his background, because of where he came from. I wasn't playing a game, she realized. I was playing a role I had created for myself, a role that was built on lies. Jamal's future after the game, the guests started to trickle out, still talking quietly among themselves. Some were in awe of Jamal, others uncomfortable with the way Clarissa had acted. The socialites, once so enamored by Clarissa's wealth and charm, were now faced with the uncomfortable truth that the world they had created for themselves was just a facade. As the evening drew to a close, Congresswoman Mills stopped Jamal before he left. "You're incredible," she said, handing him a business card. "I want to offer you a scholarship to Stanford. You've got more potential than anyone I've seen in a long time." Jamal looked at her, his face softening. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice humble. "But I'm not just interested in scholarships. I want to change things." Mills smiled, recognizing the fire in his eyes. "You will. And you'll do it with your mind, your talent, and your heart." As Jamal and Elena left the mansion, they knew their lives were about to change. What had started as a humiliating game for Clarissa Blackwood had turned into an opportunity for Jamal to prove his worth on his own terms. In the process, he had shifted the entire narrative of his life, and the world would soon take notice. Clarissa's fall. The next few days were a blur for Clarissa Blackwood. The media picked up the story of Jamal's stunning victory, with headlines such as "Teen Chess Prodigy Outplays Millionaire at Her Own Game" and "Self-Taught Genius Shatters Social Norms," flooding news outlets. The video of the match went viral, viewed millions of times within the first week, and every time Clarissa saw her face on the screen, it was a reminder of the humbling defeat she had suffered. Her social standing began to crumble. One by one, her friends and colleagues distanced themselves from her. The golf club cancelled her membership. Her name was removed from charitable events, and her business connections began to dry up. "Victoria has always been arrogant," Mr. Hamilton had said in an interview, "but I never imagined she could be so cruel." Clarissa was now a pariah, the person who had thought she was invincible, only to be brought down by the very person she had once thought beneath her. Her reputation, her influence, her life, they had all been built on the idea that she was untouchable. But Jamal's victory had torn that illusion apart. Jamal's rise. Meanwhile, Jamal Santos continued his journey, now filled with new opportunities. Stanford University had accepted him with open arms, offering a full scholarship. But even more than that, Jamal's story became a beacon of hope for countless others who had been told they weren't enough. His victory in Clarissa Blackwood's mansion had shown that greatness comes from within, not from the labels others place on you. "Chess taught me that everyone has a unique strategy," Jamal said in an interview that soon followed. "But it's the game of life that really matters. You've got to fight for your place in it." The dust from the chess match had settled, but the echoes of what had transpired continued to reverberate. Clarissa Blackwood sat alone in her sprawling mansion, staring at the chessboard in front of her. The Italian marble surface, which had once seemed a symbol of her wealth and power, now felt like a cold reminder of the humiliating defeat she had just suffered at the hands of Jamal Santos, the young man she had once thought nothing more than a servant son. The victory wasn't just about chess. It wasn't just about Jamal besting her at the game she had once considered herself an expert in. It was about something far deeper. It was about the collapse of her carefully constructed world. The people who had once revered her, the guests who had admired her wealth, her influence, and her social position, now looked at her with something entirely different: disappointment. Her wealth, her education, her privilege, all of it had meant nothing in the face of the quiet strength and unshakable intellect of the young man she had underestimated. Clarissa's isolation. The next few days felt like a blur to Clarissa. She had expected to bask in the glow of her evening success, to watch as the funds rolled in from the charity dinner, and to hear praises from her guests. Instead, she found herself at the center of ridicule. Her name, once synonymous with respect and influence, had become a punchline. News outlets quickly picked up the story. Self-taught teen defeats millionaire at her own game was plastered across social media, and the video of the match went viral within hours. Jamal had become a symbol of everything Clarissa had tried to suppress, the truth that intelligence and ability weren't bound by money, status, or race. The world was watching, and they were not watching her as the gracious hostess, but as the woman who had tried to humiliate a young man in front of an audience and failed spectacularly. The humiliation didn't stop with the media. Mr. Hamilton, a lifelong friend of Clarissa's, had been one of the first to leave her side. He had once regarded her with respect, but now he saw her for who she truly was, someone who had underestimated another human being based purely on prejudice. "I never thought she could be so cruel," Hamilton said to a reporter, his words cutting through the remaining remnants of Clarissa's pride. She tried to make a spectacle of a young man, and instead, she was the one who was humiliated. Clarissa's mind raced as she replayed the moments of the game in her head. Every move she made had been calculated to maintain control, to assert her superiority, but each move had only set her up for failure. And now, her entire world seemed to be crumbling around her. Her phone rang incessantly with calls from friends and acquaintances, all offering their condolences in one form or another. They were not sympathetic, they were apologetic. "Victoria, this is going to blow over," one friend told her, her voice laced with uncertainty. "Don't worry, people will forget about it." But deep down, Clarissa knew this was different. This wasn't something that would fade with time. She had been exposed in a way she could never have anticipated. She had lost not just a chess match, but her dignity and the respect of everyone who had once admired her. The rising tide of change. While Clarissa was left to lick her wounds in the empty mansion, Jamal Santos was living a completely different reality. The video of the chess match had exploded on social media, and Jamal's name was now synonymous with brilliance and resilience. His quiet, confident victory had turned him into an overnight sensation. He was no longer just the son of a maid, he was a prodigy, a genius who had overcome the odds. Congresswoman Jennifer Mills, who had watched the match unfold, was quick to recognize Jamal's potential. She had known from the start that Jamal was something special, but now, with the whole world watching, she saw an opportunity to change the trajectory of his life. "Jamal," Mills said in a phone call to him a few days later, "you've earned this. You've shown the world your worth. I'm offering you a scholarship to Stanford University." Jamal, still processing the whirlwind of events, was initially speechless. It felt surreal to him. He had spent years working toward a future he could only dream about, but now, that dream was becoming a reality. He wasn't just getting a scholarship, he was getting a chance to rewrite his own story, to take control of his future, and to prove that intelligence wasn't something you could buy or inherit. It was something you built. "Thank you, ma'am," Jamal said, his voice steady and calm. He had never been one to get too emotional, but this offer was more than he could have ever hoped for. "I'll do my best to make you proud." Mills smiled on the other end of the line. "I know you will," she said, her voice full of pride. "I've seen what you're capable of. Now the world will see it too." Clarissa struggled to maintain control back at Clarissa's mansion. Things were beginning to unravel quickly. The phone calls, the media, and the increasing pressure from her social circles were taking their toll. The weight of her actions had finally caught up with her. Clarissa had always been able to control her environment, bending situations to her will with her wealth and influence. But now, the very thing she had relied on to maintain her status, the power of money, was no longer enough. Clarissa's attempts to salvage her reputation were feeble at best. She attempted to make calls to various charitable organizations, asking them to distance themselves from the controversy, but no one was willing to stand by her. Her longtime friends were starting to distance themselves, not because they didn't respect her, but because they were beginning to see her for who she truly was, someone who had used her privilege to demean others. One of the last people she expected to turn away from her was Mr. Hamilton. The man who had once been her ally now refused to take her calls, and she knew it wasn't just because of the chess game. It was because he saw the true character of who she had become. "I'm sorry, Clarissa," he had said when she finally got through to him. "I can't support you anymore. I think you know why." And with that, the last thread of respect she had from her circle was severed. Jamal's new beginning. While Clarissa Blackwood struggled to pick up the pieces of her broken life, Jamal Santos was beginning a new chapter. The world had opened up for him in a way he had never anticipated. His story had inspired millions, and his quiet victory had turned him into a symbol of hope and possibility. Jamal's scholarship to Stanford University wasn't just a chance to get an education, it was a stepping stone to something greater. He had always dreamed of using his skills, his knowledge, and his experiences to make a difference in the world, and now he had the resources to do so. He had already begun planning how he would give back to the communities that had supported him throughout his life. "I've been given an opportunity," Jamal said to a reporter who interviewed him, "and now I'm going to use it to help others who are just like me. There are a lot of kids out there who don't think they're capable of achieving anything, and I want to show them they can." His chess program, which he had started to mentor other kids from underserved communities, was growing rapidly. What had started as a small initiative to teach kids chess was now becoming something much bigger, an educational outreach program designed to inspire young people to dream beyond their circumstances. Jamal's program was not just about chess. It was about teaching kids how to think critically, how to solve problems, and how to navigate the world in a way that empowered them. Clarissa's fall from grace. As weeks turned into months, Clarissa Blackwood watched helplessly as her life crumbled further. She had been forced to cancel all her upcoming events and withdraw from various charitable causes, as the media storm surrounding her continued. The video of her humiliating defeat to Jamal had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the old world order, the world that Clarissa had so comfortably lived in. Her social circle continued to shrink. Friends who had once sought her out now avoided her. "I can't believe what you did to that kid," one friend had said, after seeing the viral video. "You tried to make a fool of him, and look what happened." The harsh words had stung more than Clarissa was willing to admit. Eventually, the last of her charitable endorsements were withdrawn. The golf club cancelled her membership. Even her philanthropic efforts were overshadowed by the scandal. She had tried to control everything in her life, but now, she was a prisoner of her own mistakes. The woman who had once prided herself on being the epitome of grace and success was now just another cautionary tale. Jamal's legacy. Months later, Jamal's story was still making waves. He had continued his studies at Stanford, earning a reputation as an exceptional student not just for his intellect, but for his ability to inspire and uplift others. His program had grown beyond anything he had imagined. Jamal's quiet strength and humility had won him respect from all corners of the world, and he had become a voice for those who had been silenced by the very systems that sought to keep them in their place. Clarissa, meanwhile, had learned the hard way that wealth and privilege were not enough to guarantee success. She had tried to manipulate and control the situation, but in the end, it was Jamal's humility, intelligence, and perseverance that had won the day. He had shown her, and the world, that true greatness isn't measured by money or status. It's measured by the way you lift others up, the way you challenge the system, and the way you rise above adversity. As for Clarissa, her downfall was complete. Jamal's victory was not just about one game of chess, it was about exposing the inherent flaws in a system that valued wealth over character, power over integrity. Jamal had changed the game, and in doing so, had proved that true nobility comes not from the labels placed upon you, but from the way you carry yourself, the way you rise above those who seek to diminish you. The months following that fateful night in Clarissa Blackwood's mansion were transformative. The shift in both her life and Jamal Santos's was undeniable, but their paths were now heading in opposite directions. While Jamal's success was growing, fueled by his unshakable intellect and the vast opportunities that had come his way, Clarissa was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had been built on prejudice, privilege, and a deep-seated belief in her own superiority. As Jamal walked through the halls of Stanford University, it was hard for him to believe that just a few months ago, he had been at entertainment at a charity dinner in a millionaire's mansion. His scholarship was a dream come true, but it was only the beginning. He wasn't just at Stanford to get an education, he was there to change the system, to prove that intelligence and talent had no color, no socioeconomic status, no barrier that could keep it from flourishing. He'd already begun mentoring other students, many of whom came from similar backgrounds to his own, using his experiences to show them that their worth was not determined by the neighborhoods they grew up in, or by the assumptions others made about them. Jamal had made a vow, and he was determined to keep it, to be the person who showed the world that anyone, regardless of where they came from, could achieve greatness. Meanwhile, Clarissa Blackwood was reeling from the aftermath of the public humiliation she had suffered. Once the toast of her social circles, now, she had become a cautionary tale of hubris. The media continued to expose the stories of her failed charity events, her losing streak in social gatherings, and the ripple effects that her disdain for Jamal had caused. The video of their chess match had gone viral, and not in the way she had hoped. Jamal Santos, the young prodigy who had shone with quiet brilliance, was now the face of a new generation, one that was breaking down the walls of societal structures and rewriting the rules. Clarissa's isolation. Clarissa had tried everything in her power to restore her image, to rebuild the respect she had once commanded. She made public apologies, distanced herself from the media frenzy, and even attempted to organize more charity events to prove she was still the same gracious benefactor she had always been. But the damage had been done. The people who had once admired her for her wealth and sophistication were now questioning the very foundation of her character. The social club she had once been a part of had cancelled her membership, and the charities she had supported had distanced themselves from her. Even Mr. Hamilton, the man who had once been a close friend, now avoided her calls and barely acknowledged her in social settings. Clarissa's empire, once built on her vast wealth and status, was crumbling, and the reality of her fall from grace was starting to sink in. She couldn't help but replay the night of the chess match over and over again in her head, each time feeling the sting of Jamal's calculated moves. The final checkmate had been a defeat not just in chess, but in every part of her life that she had taken for granted. But what hurt the most wasn't the loss of a game, it was the loss of her own belief in herself. Jamal had outplayed her, not just in the game of chess, but in life. The fact that he had done it with such humility, such quiet dignity, was a blow that no amount of money or status could ever repair. She had underestimated him, and now, she was paying the price. Jamal's rise. As Clarissa stumbled through the wreckage of her past, Jamal Santos was stepping into a future that was brighter than he had ever dreamed. His full scholarship to Stanford University was only the beginning. He had been awarded grants to start a non-profit organization aimed at helping underprivileged youth learn critical thinking, problem-solving, and other life skills through chess. His program had garnered the attention of both national and international organizations, and soon, he was being invited to speak at conferences, to mentor young leaders, and to give interviews about the power of chess as a tool for social change. More importantly, Jamal had become a voice for others who had been overlooked or underestimated by society. He didn't just play the game, he had rewritten it. His story had resonated with millions, and he was no longer just a young prodigy from the slums, he was a symbol of what determination, intellect, and opportunity could accomplish. He had become an advocate for marginalized communities, using his platform to call out the systemic barriers that prevented many young people from reaching their full potential. Congresswoman Jennifer Mills, who had offered him his scholarship, continued to support him, ensuring that he had the resources and connections needed to turn his dreams into reality. Mills had seen the potential in Jamal long before the chess match. She had watched him rise above the assumptions that had been placed on him, and she was determined to make sure that his success was not a fluke, it was the start of something much bigger. Jamal's program, Chess for Change, had grown exponentially. What started as a small initiative in his hometown had now expanded to cities across the country. He had already started collaborating with other educational organizations and had begun working with universities to offer scholarships to young people who excelled in chess and other intellectual pursuits. His dream was no longer just to break free from the limitations placed on him. His dream was to ensure that others never had to face those limitations in the first place. The news spreads as Jamal continued to grow his program and expand his reach. News outlets continued to report on his progress. The story of a young boy from the slums who had gone from serving hors d'oeuvres at a charity dinner to earning a full scholarship at one of the top universities in the world became a source of inspiration for millions. Jamal had become a symbol of hope and resilience, a testament to the power of education, hard work, and perseverance. The media coverage was intense, but Jamal handled it with the same calm demeanor that had carried him through the chess match. He wasn't looking for fame or fortune, he was looking to create lasting change. He was constantly being invited to speak at conferences, to join panels, and to contribute to conversations about education reform and social justice. His story was one that needed to be told, not just to inspire others, but to show the world that change was possible, that intelligence wasn't restricted to the wealthy or the privileged. Jamal's rise was nothing short of extraordinary. He was quickly becoming a well-known figure in the world of education, social justice, and youth empowerment. His work was reshaping how people viewed the potential of children from underserved communities. He was proving, time and time again, that given the right tools and opportunities, any child, regardless of their background, could achieve greatness. Clarissa's downfall. Meanwhile, Clarissa was left to face the harsh reality of her actions. Despite her best efforts to recover from the scandal, she was being relentlessly exposed in the media as the woman who had tried to humiliate a young man and had failed spectacularly. The viral video of the chess match, where Jamal had defeated her with a calm precision, had been shared millions of times, and each view felt like another layer of her carefully constructed life being torn down. Her charity events were now being scrutinized, with critics pointing out that the very people she had claimed to help were the ones she had attempted to degrade. The social clubs that had once welcomed her with open arms had begun to distance themselves. Her reputation, once a source of pride, had become a source of ridicule. Clarissa's arrogance, her belief in her own superiority, had led her to underestimate Jamal, and in doing so, she had exposed the very flaws in her character that she had tried so hard to conceal. One by one, her colleagues abandoned her. Mr. Hamilton, who had once been her close ally, now avoided her at all costs. "I can't associate with someone who would treat another human being like that," he said to a friend when Clarissa asked him for advice. "I never thought she'd go that far." Clarissa was now facing the consequences of her actions. It wasn't just the humiliation of losing to Jamal, it was the realization that her entire worldview had been built on false assumptions that she had clung to for far too long. She had thought that money and privilege were the keys to success, but in the end, it was her lack of respect for others, her refusal to see beyond her own privilege, that had led to her downfall. The final showdown. As the days passed, Jamal's success only continued to grow. He had proven that his victory was not just about one game of chess, it was about showing the world that talent and intelligence had no boundaries. He was changing the game, both literally and figuratively, and his influence was only expanding. Meanwhile, Clarissa Blackwood remained isolated in her mansion, staring at the chessboard in front of her. She had tried to pick up the pieces of her life, but the weight of her actions had left her paralyzed. Jamal had shattered her illusion of control, and now, she was left with the cold reality of who she had become. As the months went by, Jamal continued to rise, his influence growing with every step he took. Clarissa, on the other hand, was left to reflect on the mistakes she had made. The world she had once controlled was slipping further and further out of her grasp. Conclusion. In the end, it was not just a game of chess that defined Jamal Santos's life, it was the quiet, steadfast pursuit of a dream. The dream of showing the world that greatness comes not from wealth or privilege, but from the strength of one's character, the power of intellect, and the unwavering belief that anyone can overcome the odds. For Clarissa Blackwood, it was a painful lesson in humility. The world she had lived in, a world built on false pretenses, had come crumbling down. She had underestimated the very person she had tried to belittle, and in doing so, she had lost everything she had once taken for granted. But for Jamal, the story was just beginning. The lessons he had learned through adversity, the strength he had found in the face of prejudice, would guide him as he moved forward. And as he looked ahead to a future filled with endless possibilities, Jamal knew one thing for certain: true greatness is not measured by the size of your bank account, but by the strength of your heart and the depth of your mind. The key lesson from Jamal Santos's journey is that true greatness is not defined by wealth, status, or background, but by perseverance, intellect, and character. Throughout his life, Jamal faced countless obstacles that were imposed on him because of his upbringing. Despite these challenges, he didn't let them define his future. Instead, he used them as fuel to rise above the limitations others tried to place on him. Whether it was in the chess match against Clarissa Blackwood, or in his pursuit of an education and success, Jamal showed us that talent and intelligence have no boundaries. The world may try to judge us by where we come from, but it is the choices we make and the effort we put into our growth that define us. Clarissa, on the other hand, teaches us a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating others based on superficial judgments. Her downfall was not caused by her wealth or social status, but by her inability to see beyond her own biases. She failed to acknowledge the worth of someone just because he didn't look or live the way she expected. The truth is, we all have unique potential, and that potential is often hidden from view, waiting to be unlocked by those who are willing to look beyond appearances. What happened in the chess game wasn't just a defeat for Clarissa. It was a reminder that humility, empathy, and respect for others are the true measures of greatness. Those who rise above their circumstances, like Jamal, do so not by stepping on others, but by lifting themselves up with grit, resilience, and a relentless desire to learn. And when we underestimate or dismiss others based on biases, whether race, class, or background, we not only lose the opportunity to connect with them but also limit our own potential for growth. In life, true nobility and success are earned through integrity, hard work, and an unwavering belief in one's worth. No matter where you start, if you work hard and remain dedicated to your goals, you will not only break the barriers others try to impose on you, but you will also inspire others to do the same. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to stay updated with more stories that will motivate you to never give up on your dreams. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue to build a community that celebrates resilience, integrity, and the power of growth.